Fix it in post, right?
Yeah,
I
right.
hate fixing things in post. It's just more work.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys all for coming. We appreciate you being here for our latest SCTE training session for the state of Iowa. If you haven't been to our website, it's iowaheartlandscte.org, and that's where you can always find our latest and greatest training schedules. We've got more trainings coming up later this year, and also you'll see on the website we have an Employee Appreciation Day event going on at Pin Seekers in Tiffin, so kind of between Coralville and North Liberty there. It's like one of those golf game things where you hit the ball outside. So we're going to have an event there. I think it's in September or October, so check the website for that. That'll be something that you'll want to attend. Really excited for our XGS Pon training today. We had a full house this morning for the first session, and now for this session. Welcome for everybody that's here, and I'm going to hand it off to our presenter today, and this is a presentation that Ben gave this morning and to raucous crowd. And now this is Ben Stineman with FuseTechnic.
Thanks, Curtis. Let's see if we can get that back on. I'll wait for Curtis to put my slide deck up. So yeah, thanks for coming. Just welcome. I'm not a public speaker. I'm a nerd. I'm an engineer. So
I'm nerd engineer.
Yeah. Just love this kind of technology and like to research it, like to talk about it, and like to learn with everybody else. So, so I titled this XGS Pon and Beyond. It's not a Buzz Lightyear reference. It just happened that way. I would have to contact Disney licensing anyway. So XGS Pon, it's alphabet soup. I don't know how many people realize that X actually means 10. It's Roman numeral 10 for 10 gig, right? So S meaning symmetrical, so 10 up, 10 down, which is different than some of the previous Pon versions of the past. So a bit about me. I'm a consulting network architect, independent from anything else. I just run my own consulting business. I've been in data center networking, ISP, startup, and helping with migrations to new technologies for many years, like over 10. So yeah. So since we're talking about XGS Pon as the main kind of subject matter, I thought we'd go back in time a little bit and cover some of the origins of PON, or passive optical networking. And why we have seen more of a emergence of PON over active optical networking. So the kind of the long story short, and there's many parallels to other technologies such as cable modem or HFC or DSLAM DSL. You have essentially a switch in the head end of the central office. You've got some sort of distribution. And then you've got, there could be multiple layers of distribution, but then you've got customer prem equipment, right? So there are essentially equivalents of each for each technology. So in the PON world, you have an OLT, which is kind of like what a CMTS is or what a DSLAM is. It's the switch at the central office that everything plugs into. You could have multiples of those. Depending on how big the deployment is. The cool thing about PON is it's using kind of two different multiplexing technologies, and some of you may know this, some of you may not. So I'm kind of going through a fly through of the basics of this stuff. So the cool thing about PON is it's not only using different wavelengths or different colors of light, but it's also doing a time division as well. So it's setting up time slices on those waves of light to allow multiple endpoints to connect on the same fiber. So it's essentially combining two types of multiplexing into one. You've got wavelength and you've got time division, or time division multi-access multiplexing. The first idea of it was proposed by British Telecom in the late 80s, like I think 1987, yeah. And then the IEEE and the ITU and the SCTE all kind of got on board and started to try to ratify it and make it an actual standard so that any manufacturer could adopt the standard and make equipment. So we had kind of a, equivalent playing field. So it differs from like other active technologies in that it's passive. It doesn't require power at the lower distribution layers. And that's one of the big cost benefits is you don't have to power things so close to the home. You can run them passive and you don't have to maintain additional pieces of powered equipment in the field like amplifiers as much. So some of the early versions, which we're not even going to talk about or even bother talking about, the broadband PON and asynchronous transfer mode over PON using old ATM technology over passive optical network. Just mentioning to acknowledge their existence. So kind of what I mentioned before, you've got very similar equivalents across different technologies, whether it's HFC cable with CMTSs, DSL with a DSLAM, or here in the passive or active optical networking, you've got an OLT of sorts. So the OLT is essentially the switch that everything connects to. You typically see that in a head end, a CO, or in distributed huts or other locations throughout deployment. Where it starts to differ is in the distribution, and when I'm talking distribution, I'm talking from like what we call the splitter and out to the customer, like that last mile. So the optical splitters don't require power. They're effectively an optical beam splitter that splits the laser light in like a prism. Think Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Light in, rainbow out. Kind of that, but not. And again, one of the huge benefits is it doesn't require electricity to run those in the field. You'll have a cabinet full of that stuff, and some of you guys know this because you've lived and breathed it. You've got a cabinet full of splitters and a patch bay, and all you got to do is make sure that the squirrels don't get it and other varmin. So that ultimately ends up feeding what's at the customer prem, whether it's a business or a home or a apartment building or whatever. You've got an ONT or an ONU, same thing. ONU is one standards group's term and ONT is the other standard group's term, but they mean the same thing. Optical network unit or optical network terminal. It's essentially the modem, if you want to use a different term. It's essentially a media converter going from that time division multiplexing world into Ethernet, typically, which is what we use inside of a building. And of course, that device can come in a number of forms. You've got a standard ONT, which is just the ONT. It is converting from the PON network to Ethernet, and that's it. So it's got a jack in and a jack out and power. But then you also have the type that have everything integrated. So you've got an RG or a residential gateway, which most people just refer to as their router, a baby router. And then often Wi-Fi access point built in as well. So you can have an all-in-one solution, and that works for a lot of scenarios. So to dive back into passive optical networking a little bit deeper, I was talking about that time division multi-access or time division multiplexing on top of wavelength division multiplexing. And this is a sweet graphic that somebody drew for Wikipedia. And then I've noticed many manufacturers have redrawn that graphic in their own colors. Cisco and a couple others, like almost direct copy. So the boxes, the colored boxes like A, B, C, D represent those time slots. So the OLT and the ONT are in a negotiated time slot. The OLT will assign the ONT a time slot on the cycle of repeating frames effectively. And that way you can get way more people connected to one strand instead of having to run an individual strand to every single prem. So the OLT's job is to manage that timing. It's to manage the access of those endpoints. If the endpoint's not registered correctly, it can't get on. So, that typically doesn't happen until the customer pays or signs up or whatever. So it's all of that kind of management is built in, and that's often closely linked with a billing system or a billing and provisioning system. So there's a lot going on. It's not just a switch over here. It's an access controller. So the other thing to point out is it's using different wavelengths typically for send and receive. So the time slices exist on both wavelengths or both colors of light going and coming back. There's also a way that you can push other services on a different wave, especially if a provider is running a RF-based TV system still. They can inject another beam of light onto the fiber just for the TV part, and it can pop out or come out on an RF jack on the customer prem device to plug in a set-top box. There's so many things that the manufacturers have done to allow for that kind of migration from older technologies to new technologies. So, going to mention or talk a little bit quickly about the wavelength thing. So you may or may not have seen how there's certain wavelengths you see. So like 1310 nanometer, you see that one. You see 1490. And you'll see 1550 and some other ones. And I just wanted to point out this interesting depiction of how we actually have to dance around the laws of physics and use the waves that will work on the glass. There's something called the water peak, and it's in that like 1380 nanometer range. And it's like super ineffective because the water, like the molecules of the hydrogen and oxygen molecules get excited, and it actually attenuates the signal or greatly reduces the throw. It's a little band. We can talk about it more. I'm not a physics expert at that point, but like it's interesting to see that. And we're always trying to like hit the gap in between. And as you get higher in wavelength, you're splitting hairs even more. So your optics have to be even more accurate, more tuned. So there's trade-offs with everything. That's kind of a theme. There's another depiction of that water peak situation. It starts at like 1380. It's kind of a bell curve. And this is a fun one because you got small dollar signs and you got big dollar signs. So as you go up in wavelength, the more accurate, the more tuned they have to be, and that typically means they cost more. And then as you go up, you get more chromatic dispersion. So chromatic dispersion or chromatic aberration is like that splitting of light into the rainbow fringe. And that's the only way I can describe it because we can see that. Now that happens up at these wavelengths we can't see. But if you've ever looked at like a old digital camera photo or like an old phone photo from one of the first camera phones, you might at some time see rainbow fringes around the photo. It's chromatic aberration or chromatic dispersion. There's distortions happening in the light spectrum where it breaks the light into the rainbow. Now that doesn't happen at these levels because these are not visible, but it's the best analogy I can use to kind of help describe it. So back to like how this ties in with GPON or PON or XGS Pon. Since we've got that water peak that we're dancing around, and then we're also, playing with higher wavelengths that are harder to tune. And then we're also trying to be able to have the older technology deployed with the newer technology. They're having to pick waves that don't collide with each other, but allow you to keep your old GPON and roll out XGS Pon on top of it on the same fiber. So the red is like what was typically used in most GPON. Now there's always exceptions to this. Most manufacturers were using like 1310 and 1490. So 1310 being your upstream and 1490 down. And then, so like how do we fit the next thing into this, like XGS Pon? So they chose different waves that don't overlap, but also can't be in the water peak. So these are an example from like Ciena's website about where those would sit. So you could run GPON and XGS Pon at the same time on the same fiber network.
Ben, are those now standard as far as those wavelengths for those types of PON as part of the IEEE standard?
I mean, like there's many that can be used, but these are the most common.
Most common ones?
Yeah. You start getting into the newer stuff, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, with 25G PON and 50G PON, and you start to split the hair even more. And they're carving up little chunks of light spectrum and bandwidth, like 1200, 1300, 1310, 1270, to be able to fit more in. Like I think they do this kind of leapfrogging style so that, you know, if you have a GPON and you're rolling out 10G, you can do it at the same time. But by the time you're ready to go to 25 or 50, you better be done with your old GPON so you can free up that spectrum so you can put the new stuff in that, you know? So it's like you're leapfrogging your deployments. So I think the idea is really to only have two at once. So as the years go by and technology advances and the old stuff dies off and it's not supported by the manufacturer anymore and you can't get firmware for it, you know, you're gonna have to be moving ahead and you're just kind of leapfrogging, alternating your spectrums essentially. But you can have overlap, so you can do a rolled migration instead of cut everybody off and cut everybody over at the same time, which would take a long time, or 3 days of no sleep. So back into some of the tech of passive optical networking. Some of you guys, this is known stuff, but like I found this cool graphic, I think it's from PLC, Senko. They kind of show a drawing of inside of a splitter, and you can see the input fiber. It's literally splitting it at an optical with glass, you know, 2, 4, 8, 16, out to 32. And I'm sure some of you have seen like a splitter in a box, pizza box or whatever. But those can also go in cabinets in bulk. One in on the blue and then 32 out of the black box, inside the black box, a little cassette. So this effectively allows you to serve 32, 64, 128. There's different split ratios from one fiber fed from the head end. Back more into the conceptual drawing of a PON architecture. I mentioned splitter cabinet in this drawing, which will look at photos, and I understand that everybody's at a different spot on the PON journey, or could be. So bear with me as I go through the basics. Again, at the left side, the optical line terminals in your CO or head end, or even sometimes in a distribution hut or enclosure, depending on just geographical situations. And then it goes out to splitter cabinets. You can have, you know, 10, 30, 50, you can have hundreds of splitter cabinets depending on the deployment size. And there's different size splitter cabinets that can handle different counts of fiber and splitters. So let's see, covering all of that. So kind of a physical representation. I've got two different versions of this. You'd have some sort of core router or core switching that OLT switch plugs into. This happens to be a Nokia FX16. So it's a 16 slot OLT chassis with 8 ports per card. So it's 128 ports. So you'd feed it out to a splitter cabinet that looks something like that. From the CO or the head end, you'd run whatever made sense from an outside plant perspective, whether it's, you know, 12, 24, 48, maybe even 144 count fiber. And sometimes they do it in a ring, so you'd have redundant feeds to a splitter cabinet. It all depends on geography, budget, planning, et cetera. But the point is to light a splitter cabinet and fan out even further. So you could have 10, 20, you know, you could probably have up to, I don't know, what's the biggest splitter cabinet people have seen, like cassette wise? 32 cassettes. I mean, it's going to depend on if it's CommScope or Clearfield, like pick your flavor. But, you know, they can definitely go from small to huge And then you're talking hundreds and hundreds of fibers out to the customer. So I'm just showing one splitter here, but essentially there can be maybe 32 of these in one of these cabinets. So you're feeding 32 fibers in and you're getting 32 times 32 or 32 times 64 out. We'll talk a bit more about split ratios here in a few minutes, because obviously there's always trade-offs, right? Another way to do this is you'll have distributed OLTs. So the OLTs may not sit in the head end, or you might have some that sit in the head end and some that are distributed in different buildings. It all depends on how far you can, like light levels. Like, so if you've got a larger deployment, you may not be able to have enough light budget to get all the way to the end of the splitter if you fed everything from the central office. Central office builds work great for smaller communities. Heck, you might even have a massive apartment community that you might actually put a small OLT at and just Ethernet backhaul it to. The sky's the limit in terms of permutations on how to do these distribution layers. There's just another depiction of a similar layout. So let's just run numbers quick. That 12U OLT shelf that's back here, this thing right here, that's the 8, that's the 4. There we go. This thing, 128 ports, right? So 128 ports feeds, let's see, if everything was close and it was a dense urban area and you could feed 128 1x64 splitters, you're going to be able to serve like over 8,000 endpoints, which is crazy. It doesn't always work out that way because of light budgets, how long fiber is, because as you split more, you lose more light. So that's the trade-off. So you might have a mix of 1x32 or even 1x16, depending on how far your throw or your distance you need to shoot. So, so back to the history a little bit, just to show the progression through like when the standards were created and you know what the bandwidth did over time. 2004, Ethernet PON or PON came about as we know it, and even had some adoption and got rolled out in new builds. And that was 1.25 gig up and down symmetrical, but then you're typically splitting it 16 or 32 ways, and you know that's a shared bandwidth. But for like the mid 2000s into the early 2010s, that was pretty darn good for bandwidth wise. GPON comes around 2008 as a standard, and then it gets pretty wide adoption by providers like Google Fiber and Verizon Fios and AT&T and all that. And then a bunch of you know, smaller utilities, smaller regional providers took on with it too. And it's probably had the widest adoption of anything to date. And that went to like a 2.5 gig download and a 1.25 gig upload, which is fine because these are typically serving eyeball traffic, right? We're consumers of the internet. We're pulling bigger things down than we're pushing out. So the asymmetric thing works, and it's worked for a long time on other technologies too, like DSL and cable and DOCSIS. So you get to 2010, of course, the standards communities and the researchers are always pushing the boundary because we need to be able to do more. How much can we squeeze out of this? And we start seeing a couple of different 10 gig style PONs. There was NG PON 2, there's just XG PON, and then the one that's really emerged as the main one is XGS Pon, which most equipment providers are rolling out equipment for now. And it's actually getting adoption, especially in new builds, or if they're replacing an older technology like DOCSIS or DSL. They're just going to XGS Pon because finally the volume of production of those is up enough that the cost has come down. So you're always, you know, weighing that sweet spot of cost versus how new is it or how much bandwidth you can get. So XGS Pon was like fully codified in 2016, and we're really seeing it being pushed, not pushed, but deployed, especially in new builds or replacement builds. And I'm not sure if, does anyone do video overlay still, like an RF feed with XGS Pon. I've not heard of it like we used to do or see in the GPON days, but because I think by the time the XGS Pon is in place, like the IPTV thing is happening more, or there's more of a shift to it. So if TV service is still being provided, it's done in a different delivery method. But it's interesting, the evolution of it all. So a lot of people, when I explain PON, they're like, yeah, that's great, but how can 32 customers get fast speeds off of a single strand that can only do 1.25 gig? And yes, it's oversubscribed. Like that's the whole thing, is you're connecting more people on the same piece. But the one thing that is really important to think about is like, as your bandwidth availability, and it's not divided 32 ways, everybody gets access to the equal amount or the same amount of available bandwidth on that. And things obviously happen much quicker. Your downloads are way faster. You buffer in a video stream way quicker at that speed, and your time on the line, your time using the bandwidth is way shorter. So it's more, ends up being users are spiking and just, you don't have plateaus of bandwidth. It turns into that because of the density of customers, but yeah, it's way more spiky. Now, of course, a drawback or a trade-off is that you could have a noisy neighbor. You've got the guy that's doing 5-bit torrents constantly for weeks on end, like downloading the entire internet and, consuming 800 or 900 megabits of his available download for hours at a time, and essentially crowding that PON. So that noisy neighbor syndrome you have to kind of deal with and manage on a case-by-case basis. And you use the management tools and the software that you can say, oh, well, there's this whole string of this street that's really quiet. They barely use the internet, and you move that guy off to there. So you put that noisy neighbor on a lesser used link. That's one of the things that has to get managed. So. So like the next thing I want to talk about and kind of circle back to is this whole deploying the newer stuff with the older stuff. And some providers are in this situation where they rolled out GPON in 2009 or 2010, and now that equipment is pushing 15 years old or thereabouts. It's probably or definitely past end of life. Like you can't get parts for it anymore. You can't get software updates. They're just abandoning the product. And don't get me wrong, GPON was deployed, it's still being deployed, but there's going to be a situation where you need to deploy new stuff and you don't have to cut everybody over at once. So you're going to have to overlay or coexist. So like this graphic was cool. I found it hypotic.com. They had this great coexistence graphic. So one of these examples is like I mentioned the RF video. You might be converting your TV head end RF into optic so you can deliver it. That gets injected on one wavelength. You've got your old GPON from say 2012, and now you're rolling out XGS Pon. So you can effectively get a reverse splitter or a coexistence element and combine those all onto the same fiber. And depending on which ONT they have plugged in at the premise, it just looks for the light that it's only tuned for the light channels that it needs. So it allows for that rolling update kind of a scenario. Yeah, in this example, they've got, downstream at 1490 nanometer, upstream at 1310, and video at 1550 on the GPON legacy. And then the XGS Pon, they're running down at 1578 and upstream at 1270. So you're putting all these colors or wavelengths of light on the same fiber. And then depending on which piece of hardware you have at the end, at the customer prem, it just joins onto the light beam that it's tuned for. So why not active? I mean, plenty of providers have done active Ethernet or active optical networking. You still have like an optical line terminal or termination point, but then instead of passive splitters, you're re-amplifying or you're repeating, and you just have a lot more equipment to maintain. It costs more because those are more expensive than passive splitters. There was adoption of it, and there probably is still adoption, and I think it all depends on the scenario that it's being deployed in. But it's not something that can scale to the level that passive can. So again, it's always trade-offs, right? Just to run through some photos, this is a newer build for a smaller town. It's a CO, a central office build, so there's no active equipment in the field. This serves, I think, 43 splitter cabinets. Those feeds all come back into these patch panels, and you don't see it, but there's another rack row that will be built behind it to house more OLTs when it's needed. But this can serve probably between 13 and 15,000 endpoints in 5 racks, and that includes the DC plant. So, like, that's another thing. Like, everything's getting smaller too, and that's been a huge advantage. You can deploy these things and not have to have an entire data center.
And Ben, your power budget and therefore your air conditioning budget is a lot.
It can be, yeah.
than an optical plant.
Now, this doesn't have a TV head end.
Right.
They don't do television. There's some providers that will, like, literally give you an over-the-air antenna, because some people literally only want local channels, but they forgot that they can put an antenna up. And then, you know, pick from the streaming providers for TV or dish or whatever, right? So some newer providers are just choosing not to do TV at all. But yeah, like, this is the entirety of it, like, including back office management, billing system, and everything is all in this 5 racks. Pretty wild. So a little closer look at, well, this is an OLT. It's a Nokia or an Alcatel. Nokia bought Alcatel, if you didn't notice. So this is that 12U. I think it's 12 or 15U. I can't remember. The fan takes up more. Basically put 120 or 128 XGS optics into this chassis with multiple 100 gig and 40 gig uplinks in the middle cards there into the core. So this chassis can basically serve about just shy of 8,200 customers if you were able to deploy everything at 64, 1:64 split. Are they doing that? No, because, well, there's limitations to the light budget. So I think they're expecting to get 5,000 to 6,000 served off of this chassis, and then they'll put another one in. So, and then that's an optic. So, like, that's what that literally, it looks like any other SFP. There are some combo SFPs that look a little bit larger, longer. They have a different connector on the end, and some of them have heat sinks that hang out the front of the chassis so air can flow over it. Quite interesting. And some are actual, they look like a transmit and receive optic, but it's actually 2 PON ports on 1 SFP. So some manufacturers are doing that. Back to distribution, just as a real world, drawings are great, but photos are better. We have, this is a smallish splitter cabinet, and I think they have a 2 12 count fiber, and they did it in a ring. So they got 12 strands one way and 12 strands the other. Or is it 24 both ways? I can't remember. I think they did 24, but they only bring 12 up from the handhole. So they're bringing 2 24 counts into the vault, and then they're just pigtailing up 12 from each side. So they've got extra. They can do an expansion. They could replace this cabinet with a bigger one if they had to. But you can see where the splitter cassettes go in these little slots here. This is like right after it was put in, and they got the splicing done. So this hadn't been even set up. I think they were just doing the review and looking at getting the first couple test customers set up on this particular splitter. So 12 or 24 coming up into these. I think it holds 14. I think it's the CommScope. Can't remember. Somebody could probably correct me if I'm wrong. basically put 12 or 14 splitters in this, and then that would split out to whatever this array is. I don't remember the count, but essentially there's a home or a business on the end of each one of those white fibers. So that's how it gets fanned out. Let's see. And then at the prem, you might have a hand hole between the sidewalk and the street. There's 27 ways to do this too. This particular one was using an MST product. I know there's opinions on those. Some people like them, some people hate them. But it's a way of putting 4 or 8 or 16 strands to one group of houses, or maybe to a small condo setup with 4 or 6 units. And then you can run from the hand hole a drop to the prem, to the actual building, and then that's where you go into the house or the business or the apartment. So, yeah. So then inside, we're just going down the chain here. I picked one brand. I've messed with them all, but I had enough photos for the Nokia stuff, so that's the direction I went. Here you've got a regular ONT. It is effectively just a modem, a media converter. You've got OLT PON coming into the green port from that splitter, and you've got Ethernet coming out. And that Ethernet would be essentially a WAN port that you'd need to plug into a gateway. So whether that's the customer-owned Netgear Nighthawk thing, or their Ubiquiti Dream Machine, or their TP-Link, or whatever they have, or it could be a RG Wi-Fi combo that the service provider manages through managed Wi-Fi too. Like I don't know how many permutations there are. And then you throw in mesh Wi-Fi and all these other add-ons, right? This one is a Nokia all-in-one. So PON comes in from the splitter into the bottom. There's the green port's on the bottom underneath. And then you've got what looks like a residential home router. You've got 4 LAN ports, a couple phone ports, and there's Wi-Fi built into the top of it. So those are popular in the service providers that want to offer added services like managed Wi-Fi, voice, etc. So back to the future of PON. Like how high does this ceiling go? We always ask these things, right? Oh, we just got gig 10 years ago. Now we have 10 gig. What's next? 25, of course, right? It's kind of following the Ethernet trends, right? There's 25 gig, there's 40 gig Ethernet, there's 100 gig Ethernet. So yes, there's 25 gig PON, there's 50 gig PON, and there is plans for 100 gig PON. And often the question is, why? But PON is being used for not just feeding end users like residential or business customers. Like it's starting to be used for mobile backhaul. So the 5G mobile phone spectrum uses higher frequencies, which are shorter wavelengths, which don't have the throw as the older frequencies. So they end up having to put more antennas out. It's a denser deployment. They're putting them on. They're not erecting like dedicated towers. They're just putting them on power poles and light poles and things like that. So you start thinking about that, and it's like, oh, well, we could just make 5G cell antennas with a PON port in it. So all you got to do is, get a power tap at the top of the light pole, hang this antenna, and plug a PON drop into it. And then all it is essentially an ONT with a cellular antenna on it. So a lot of the higher bandwidth stuff is being driven by those things, by mobile, by public Wi-Fi, all sorts of things. And then also just city infrastructure, traffic cameras, you name it, automatic meter reading antenna base stations. They not that those require a lot of bandwidth, but having the ability to plug in almost everything is kind of the initiative. So yes, we're doing all of this apparently. So just to touch on those future specs, and I haven't found a lot of good solid data on the 100 gig stuff yet because it's still like that lab situation going But the 25 gig and the 50 gig are pretty much solid now. And it's interesting because some of the manufacturers of equipment have firmly gotten behind the 25 gig as like the next thing. But then there's a lot of them that said 25 gig's not a big enough jump. We're not even messing with it. We're going to go straight to 50 gig. So they're going from 10 to 50. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons. 25 gig has some flexibility in the standards. You can use a single wave depending on your deployment. You can use, you know, you can basically make it symmetrical or asymmetrical depending on the limitations of your deployment. But yeah, we're still using the same fiber as we did in 2008 to do GPON. That's the kind of the cool thing about the glass is we don't have to replace the outside plant entirely. And we're still talking about getting to 100 gig on the same fiber. So the investment that the community put in or that the provider put in to put that glass in the ground, it's got staying power. They just keep upgrading the ends of it. So actual adoption of deployment, I think, yeah, this is fs.com, fiber supply, yeah. I think they have their own little timeline of like, not just adoption of the standard, but actual deployment of the standard. So, and a lot of this is based on what can you get at the time and, you know, how we had supply chain issues a few years ago. Some people had to just deploy GPON because they couldn't get Xgs Pon. You know, and do it in a limited time or a limited scope so they could wait to get the equipment to do more Xgs Pon. So like, this is a very rough curve of popularity, but will we see 50 gig GPON deployed in 2027? You might see some of it. I think we'll be lucky to see 25 gig because there is actually initiatives from Google Fiber and I think Verizon that are using the Nokia 25 gig to do 25 gig deployments. And of course, Google and Verizon are the 900-pound gorillas that people know. But you know, they're the ones that also buy the most equipment from a Nokia or a Calix or an Adtran or pick your flavor. Will we see 50 gig in regional providers in 2027? Maybe. I think it'll probably be in the 2030s that we'll see that, and it'll probably be limited because the XGS investments that they're doing now and into the late 2020s will be good enough for their scenario. Now, if, you know, it's a denser urban environment and you have those needs for mobile backhaul or the other things we've talked about, you're going to see more of that higher stuff adopted, but it'll be a limited deployment and they'll do it as an overlay. So nonetheless, we have this like 8 to 10 to 12 year cycle of you know, technology advancing and the next big t-shirt size of bandwidth being available and then widely available is you know, lags a little bit. So it's interesting to observe. So another illustration of the I was trying to figure out who of the major PON equipment manufacturers were like stating their 25 gig versus no, we're waiting for 50. And this is kind of what I found. These ones right here are kind of not really declaring anything. Nokia has definitely said, yes, we're doing 25. They'll of course do 50 too, but like the Calixes and the Huawei and the Adtrans are not even bothering with 25. They're going straight to 50. They're just going to keep doing XGS Pon with their existing product lines and then get a solid 50 gig product out the door. That's their marketing, you know, that's what they've made press releases about. It's interesting to see this stuff though. It will be very interesting because I'm sure that some of these will change, right? They'll be like, oh, we'll do 25. You know, they can't get the 50 gig product out the door right away, so they'll change and decide to do the 25 gig product. But I think there's definitely going to be, you'll start to see this 25 and 50 gig OLT cards available And depending on the manufacturer, you might even be able to put it into existing Xgs Pon chassis. So you can kind of do a hybrid deployment or an overlay of some of these higher bandwidth stuff, these higher bandwidth protocols, along with the legacy stuff. So that's what I got. Anybody have questions or comments or want to rake me over the coals on something I said incorrectly?
I always ask questions if nobody else does, because I'm always the dumbest guy in the room with technology. The companies that are adopting 25G for the next generation versus the one that adopts 50. If somebody picks the wrong lane, are they going to be screwed 10 years from now? No.
I don't think so. Like Nokia put their cards on the table for 25 gig and made a whole press thing about it.
Yeah.
But you know they're going to do 50 too. Like they're not going to skip 50. I think they're just saying we're going to make the investment in 25 as a stopgap or whatever and be one of the only ones. But I think you're going to see some of those that declared they're not going to bother with it. They'll probably backpedal and say, okay, we'll do some 25. Because I think it always takes longer to get that next generation product out the door and get it stable. So you might see a Calix or an Adtran say, oh, okay, yeah, we have a 25 gig PON card now, right? Like there's one thing about press releases and marketing and planning and all the forecasting of that technology. So I think there might be a situation where we see some of those other ones say, oh yeah, we're doing 25 too, but it'll be interesting.
This industry, we can't hardly launch a new system until 2 years and it's already expired and
Yeah, I know.
next thing. So it's a constant evolution of
Yeah.
It gets old fast.
Yeah. You're trying to get like the fastest you can that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, but then how soon is it going to be obsolete?
As soon as you get done, you upgrade.
Right. I think the good thing though is like, yes, gig was great, GPON was great, but now if we start doing XGS Pon, which is truly mature, I think that curve flattens out. And right, and like if we end up having XGS Pon pretty much everywhere, we've replaced the GPON and we've replaced the HFC by 2030, maybe, right? Like the need for more than that 10 gig per PON is going to be less. Now you add over the top TV streaming, however it's delivered, right? It's just bits down the line. Yeah, that adds to it. But if you're only watching 2 or 3 streams and everybody's got at least gig, and I'm talking like future tense, like 2032 here. Everybody, like pretty much everybody's got gig that uses TV, or they don't know they have gig, but you do it because you can deliver the video or whatever. They might only be paying for 500 meg of internet, but you got to deliver video too. There's so many ways this could be spun, right? But I want to think that 10 gig will last us longer than 1 gig did, right? We'll see. But you might be doing that hybrid thing. You might, there might be some more busy neighborhoods than others in terms of internet traffic. And that's when you say, oh, we're going to put a 25 gig capable chassis in, and you light up a splitter in that neighborhood for that, right? You can kind of run that stuff in parallel.
And with bandwidth, it's a lot, and sometimes more than need.
Oh, totally.
You say, they've got it.
Right.
They'll need it.
Right. They want to
to their gamer friends, so.
Yeah, it's bragging rights. It's a story, right? Yeah.
Another question I thought of then is that you've got, and I've seen multiple displays or demonstrations of this, a PON on a port on an SFP. And they use like white label routers. And so you don't need the chassis that you spend lots of money from Calix with. And are we going to see inference like that start to take away from the big guys? Like, probably a lot of people in this room are Calix, some of your Adtran, you maybe Nokia, I don't know, but it just seems to me like there are some innovators out there that are going to maybe make the marketplace more competitive than it's been.
Yeah, I think you're going to see that. I mean, even Ubiquity has an OLT, right? Will you see an emergence of like OLT on a stick, like a GPON OLT that just goes into an Arista or a Cisco switch? Maybe, but then like you've got this management component, right? The actual OLT itself does a lot of, you know, the actual access control, the bandwidth shaping. I don't know. That's an interesting one. I haven't put a ton of thought into, but you could. I think we're going to see more white label. I had a logo up there called Radisys. They're one of the ones that like develop software for OLTs, but they don't do the hardware. So they develop the software control plane layer that runs on some other piece of like generic OLT hardware. So like you can buy like Facebook or Meta, they develop their own switch fabric and they buy chips or FPGAs and they build their own switches for their giant data centers like the one in Altoona, right? So like they're not buying a Cisco or an Arista or a Juniper switch. They're buying a generic, no label, you know, black or white box, you know, it's nondescript, but then they're running their own version of the code on it. So like Radisys developed like the virtual OLT layer, and you just plug in, they have like 5 or 6 different compatible pieces of hardware that, you know, it's a chassis with OLT ports on it. So it's kind of an abstraction layer. You're separating that control plane from the data plane. So I think you'll see more of that. And I think like some of the ZTEs, like the one's in Malaysia, one's in China, but they're making their own branded ones, but then they also make the unlabeled ones. So like, you know, it's hardware. It's a box that you can run whatever software. Now that obviously, since you don't have a turnkey solution, you could run into issues. But you know, I think once the OLT ratified standards are good enough that if the hardware is compliant, you can pretty much do that. There's loads of caveats. Just like there's drawbacks with every single manufacturer of OLT.
Yeah. Well, it's like a lot of other, you know, a lot of the manufacturers have determined that, you know, these PON developers have determined the real money is in the software, the real money is in the support, the real money is in the analytics that they can bring to the table. And so they're less concerned about selling you a box than they are about selling you all the intelligence that makes the box give you what you need to operate your network well.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're seeing that not just in access layer OLT stuff, you're seeing it in the routing layer, right? You know, one place that's become common is like in carrier grade NAT and virtual BNG, you're no longer buying a Cisco or a Juniper to run that aspect of it. You're buying a Dell machine, a server, or some other kind of generic server hardware that's got the right Intel chipset that has all of that stuff in the silicon they can do in hardware, and some other company is just writing software to control it. So that's another play. So you're paying for software on a $5,000 server instead of buying a $50,000 or $100,000 server from Juniper or Cisco. But you're buying, you know, $30,000 piece of software to go in a $5,000 box. So it ends up being cheaper, but you're dealing with 2 things instead of just one thing off the shelf. But if you've got the staff and the know how to deal with it, it can be a huge savings. So that'll be interesting to watch too as time marches forward.
Any other questions from anybody here? Of course, those of you who are going to be watching this virtually, you can't really ask questions, and sorry for that, but you can always fire off questions to us when you watch this session, and we'll try to do our best to get answers back to you.
Yeah.
With that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you. Everybody give our presenter a round of applause. And again, I'll just put in the plug for the website. Check out iowaheartlandscte.org. That's where our training schedule is, and we've got more coming up this year, and the more the merrier. Hope to see you there.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.